This is Synopsis, a series of conversations with composers in the framework of Abeceda Institute. I'm Neža Zupanc, and today's guest is Asim Singh Halwarvi. Asim, welcome, and please a couple of words of introduction.
Thank you, Neža. Yes, I'm Asim. I'm a composer. I'm based in Rotterdam. I come from Chandigarh, India. It's in the state of Punjab. And I've been living here in the Netherlands for the last 6 years, and I just finished my master's. And now I'm a freelance composer and working also as an improviser. Yes.
Being from India, how deeply connected are you with improvisation? Did you grow up also learning the traditional Indian music?
Yes, I did. But how I started my musical journey was playing the keyboard and playing some Hindi film songs as a child, and that smoothly
That
transitioned to piano.
Bollywood, the songs, or
Yeah,
just
I prefer to call it Hindi film industry, which is
okay.
also known as Bollywood.
Yeah.
I just prefer the other term; it's more clear.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so film songs from Indian movies of the past, I would play them on the keyboard, and I would really enjoy playing with both my hands, playing chords. That's how it started. And I made a transition to piano performance, uh, reading staff notation. So that's how it started. And then I think around the age of 12, 13, I started my first Hindustani classical music lessons in voice, in vocals, briefly to get an overview of the music because I used to listen to that music in the car, on the radio. And so, yeah, my interest towards that music developed. So I wanted to have an idea of how ragas and talas work. But that was a very brief introduction. Like I did it maybe for a year and I stopped my lessons. Uh, and I switched to other things like playing the piano again and playing the drums. So I went back and forth. But then when I was 17, I started my Hindustani lessons again, and I continued for a few more years in vocals and harmonium performance as well, the Indian harmonium. And
Harmonium is interestingly widespread instrument in India, right?
yes, and it's an Indian adaptation of the German harmonium, I think, because you don't play with pedals. You sit on the floor or you stand, and you play the harmonium with one hand, and you give it the air with the other hand.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I played this for a while as well. So I did have some context about Hindustani music before I came into contemporary composition.
And how did you get to composition? How did you decide to start composing, in fact?
This is interesting. I was in the conservatory in India, in the south of India, and I was studying piano performance there because they were offering a bachelor's degree course, and they had the affiliation with the Middlesex University. This college is called PM Music Conservatory. It's based in Chennai, and I was studying there for 4 years. So in my first 2 years, I was doing this degree course, and I was studying piano performance. And that's where I got to hear about composition lessons. And I had no idea about these lessons, and some of my friends took it. And I had a spark of creativity. So I had an inclination towards composition. I just didn't know what does it mean to compose music in that curriculum, in that context of Western music. So I just in my third year I jumped into that just to know what it is, and that's how it started. Yes.
did you expect to, let's say, if we now start gearing towards your opus, did you expect to start to compose anything of the like that you're composing today at that time? Perhaps we can speak. You can speak to your practice first through this lens of what perhaps you expected from composition and how you perhaps conceive of composition today.
Well, to answer your first question, I didn't see this coming. I did not see myself doing this at all because I had no idea about this music. Um, so because I had a background of film songs, um, and Hindustani classical music and semi-classical forms in Hindustani music, like Qawwali, Ghazal. That was my background. So everything was very song-based. So no, I did not see myself doing this at that time. And what was your other question? I didn't understand that.
Perhaps a comparison of what you see your compositional practice being today versus what you how you imagined it to be perhaps before you started.
Yeah. Before I started, I think I didn't have any framework of what my composition practice is going to be. I wanted to understand. I was coming out of a lot of curiosity about this music. So I just wanted to know what this is and how people are thinking, how composers think when they make this kind of music, and why choose to make these kind of sounds and noises and all of that, where it becomes so abstract that it's not even about melody, harmony, rhythm anymore, in a certain sense. So I'm like, how is this music and how are they thinking? Why are they making this? I had all these questions. So I did not even imagine I would get to a point where I'll be composing this kind of music myself. So I did not have any idea. But to still answer the question, I think that my teacher was quite keen that I start to think conceptually. So in my first few composition lessons, my teacher Jimmy, uh, he really made sure that I think conceptually. I bring up my own concepts that give me direction to compose pieces. And so what happened was I thought for a while when I was having these lessons that contemporary composition or new music is conceptual music. Like if you want to compose music, experimental music, as a consequence, you think conceptually. Always start with a concept. This was the framework given to me when I had no idea about composition. Um, which changed when I moved to Rotterdam because I only had lessons for 1 year in India with Jimmy. And then, so the whole framework changed. The first thing my teacher made sure when I came here, he said that you don't have to start with a concept. You can start with a sound. You can start with material. You can start with anything you like. Anything that gives you direction is a starting point for your piece. The point is to have direction. And the idea is not to stick with the concept throughout. If you can start with a concept to have direction, and then if you feel that something outside of the concept is sonically more interesting, then do that. Use the concept as a starting point and then go in a direction using your own musicality and make interesting sounds, organize them in the way that you find interesting, and you don't have to be bound to the concept. That is what changed mainly when I moved here to Netherlands. So I did not, it was very liberating, but I did not see this coming. I did not see myself breaking that framework so soon. but it was so ingrained in my practice initially that I thought this, because I had no other context. I had no other composers around me making this music. I was really in a small bubble, just taking composition lessons with not much context. And then I started to realize that it's very liberating to start a piece um, just with material, without any, without feeling bound to a certain conceptual idea, non-musical idea.
And is this now the prevalent methodology of your composition?
I don't know if I want to say that I have a certain methodology that I always follow, because every piece gives me a different challenge, and I want to approach it in the way that the piece demands of me or asks me to approach it. Um, but yes, in the last few uh, pieces, my practice has been starting with just making material. Um, Sometimes the concept comes on the way. Sometimes I have a brief idea about what the concept is, and I start making material in a certain direction, and then the material informs the concept, and the concept informs the material. It goes quite back and forth, and then a piece is finished. That also happens. But a lot of the times there is no idea, and I just start making, improvising and playing around with some sounds, and I like them, and I make selections, and I see what's the best way to put them together. So I'm trying to be flexible with my uh, approach.
And if I understand, material, so still sound has a very important role, or material, or how do you call it? Do I use the terms correctly in this context? Sound is the
Yeah,
material that you were speaking of, or then the
sound is the
written,
material.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sound
And
is the material.
how did you get to, because there's lots of electroacoustic music and acoustic music in your composition. How exactly did that penetrate your practice?
Uh, I think this happened in two ways. One, that I was studying orchestration before in India, so I had some idea about acoustic composition and instruments. When I came here, I realized that there were electronic music composition lessons, and I was quite interested in that. So after 1 year of studying in the bachelor at Codarts, I made a switch to studying main subject electronic music, because that's something I didn't know. So I wanted more time in that subject. Um, and so that became um, like a routine, like a practice of using those tools, using DAW programs and Max to some extent, and improvising with those tools. So one was this, that it was curiosity, and the other was I think that it was very liberating to make music, uh, make material, improvise, and create sounds, and imagining something and having a result right away. This is what electronic music practice gave me. When I was composing acoustic pieces, I would write something on the score and imagine how it would sound, and then go to a rehearsal, and then the performer would play it, and then I would get an idea, and which which is a great practice to develop your sonic imagination. But when I was much younger, because I did not come from this background where I had listened to a lot of ensembles playing, initially it was a bit of a struggle to develop that musicality, that, oh, I can clearly imagine how this bassoon playing in the high range would sound, for example. So when I switched to electronic music, I would think of an idea, make a sound, and immediately get the result. And coming from the background of improvised music and Hindustani music, I was very used to not reading scores and playing music by listening. So it changed its form uh, because it was now the same in electronic music, but the way of working was very similar. It was playing something and listening and responding. And that was also very liberating in my practice. So that is why I inclined towards that.
And you mentioned routines. Usually, for me, I think of routines in music. I simply tend to think of more acoustic instruments and practicing it. How do routines in music, in electronic music production, look like for you? What does that consist of?
Right. I have two answers to this question. The first answer is the very ideal answer. The second answer is the reality, at least my reality. So the first ideal answer would be that I think in electronic music or electroacoustic music, the routine is, which also my teacher would definitely agree, I'm quite sure, is that you play with sounds, not with the idea of composing a piece. You have tools, you have programs, you have audio recordings, you record sounds, you process them. You just play with sounds and you see what you can make with a certain sound without the intention of reaching a goal. And you do this every day, right? Uh, it can be max patches, it can be super collider coding, it can be just playing it with plugins in Ableton and processing audio files, it can be using a synthesizer and making different patches. But the idea is to just make something and see what you like. And in this process of practicing with these tools and making sounds, eventually something will just spark in your mind and you will have an idea for a piece because you will have a material that you like. Plus, you will be refining your skills by practicing it, basically. And so that is how it ideally should be approached, and what I guess most electronic composers do, and I do it as well. The reality is, that's the second answer. The reality is that I'm not very consistent with, I have not been very consistent with this practice. Unfortunately, when I was studying, because when you're studying, you have too many obligations with a lot of different subjects, projects, lessons, deadlines, and sometimes it's difficult to make that consistency, to be honest. One day I have this deadline, the next week I'm submitting something else, and the focus keeps changing. You eventually come back to composing because that is what you're doing mainly. But sometimes it's difficult because the idea is to make a lot of pieces and learn from that experience and work with other musicians, and you have to be on your toes composing. So sometimes what I'm trying to say is that sometimes you are just focused on making the piece and getting it done and having the experience of having a piece performed in a concert because some project is coming up, and you're not just sitting and playing around freely. So that is the other answer. So now that I'm graduated from the masters, I don't have any academic obligations. I am now building my routine where I sit and just practice with different tools and refine my skill.
Beautiful. And from what I could read, and we don't have to go into the specifics since it's not published yet, but and from what I'm hearing, you are working with very clear and set concepts. Anyway, the term concepts already arose so many times now. Um, what exactly is your concept of compositional practice next to what we already addressed now? So there's practicing practicing what you were describing in the programs and with sound, are there other parts of your practice that are fairly or perhaps inconsistent, consistent, but that are constantly happening?
Other aspects of my practice. You mean besides using these tools that I talked about?
Yeah.
I think
I would say that already the thesis I read is the writing is one of the practices I can see here. Because
yes.
there's a lot of theoretical work being done there, a lot of integrated references of other composers. Perhaps you can speak to that. How do you integrate these influences that you mentioned that come from works of other composers into your practice? How do you work with that?
I think, yeah, of course, listening to different musics, for me, especially experimental music, electroacoustic music, acoustic music, it is very inspiring to know how other composers in the past, uh, how they approached uh, electronic music composition or composition in general, how they thought about sounds and combinations and organizing them. You just get an insight on how composers were thinking about their own practice. And for me, I, it's like I listen to a piece and there are moments that I like, there are sounds that I like, and I just think how it's made and
Mm-hmm.
what was the approach of the composer to get to a certain result, or reading about the piece or any historical, socio-political context if it has one. And how are they communicating that through only sounds? There are too many layers that I do want to know about, but my first priority is the sound, the on an abstract level. How are these sounds made? What tools were they using at that time? So yes, that is very inspiring. At the same time, I would say that improvising with other musicians is a great tool. Not just sitting in your own room and playing with these tools, that's great as well. You need to do that. But at the same time, you go out and you improvise with your instrument and you play with other musicians. You work with them and just make improvised music. I think that's a really good practice for composers. For me, it has turned out to be quite useful.
And what does improvisation in this context mean? We hear improvisation today a lot. And how do you use that term in your practice?
How do I use that term? I think it involves spontaneity for me and logical thinking, uh, to come up with ideas immediately and have some direction with them, with those ideas. Um, I think it's one of the best ways for me to make sonic material, is to start improvising.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Sometimes you choose to do a certain thing, a certain sound. Sometimes you have happy accidents. You didn't intend to do something and something happens because you changed quickly a knob or you played a certain note, um, and something happened and you liked that and you start repeating it. So
Mm-hmm.
you come into the state of flow of
Mm-hmm.
just doing without overthinking, and that is a very uh, yeah, useful tool, I think, for me at least.
Yeah, as you said at the beginning, it's, if I understood you correct, also where you drive your inspiration or where you generate your compositions, right? Um,
Yeah.
well, why I ask why I ask this is just because there's this big connotation of improvisation historically, from both classical music and perhaps a more widely referred to from jazz music. So I'm always curious, in what way does someone's working with that notion account for its history, and the historical practice of it. How do you come from improvisation now? Because this conversation, main subject is compositional practice, and one of the intents is to shed, as I told you, light to your compositional practice for someone that perhaps never heard any work of yours and that might go to listen it now. And let's say for someone, because what we tend to do is speak as if everything is already clear, right? Because for you this is a daily reality, and for someone that for someone else it's something completely new. How would you, for that person, go at explaining or presenting how this process goes, bringing something to improvisation, and then from improvisation to a finite compositional work, or finite, arguably, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
But in simple words, from improvisation to composition, what happens?
The simple answer is the filtering out material that you would not want to use, and then dealing with what you're left with. Or the other way, making selections of sounds that you really like, you really think this sound should be in the piece. So that is one of the main things to make decisions. You have a lot of material. Now you know that this is enough to make this piece. So let me just start selecting. I think I'm at some point you just feel I'm done making more material. Let me start selecting material now from what I have, and then I will see later if I need more material, then I will improvise again. But I have to start organizing this to see if I already find direction with what I have. So that is the most straightforward answer.
And I assume you're there working with material, as in, let's say, you find a melody that's you afterwards use, but also you record something and use the recording in your composition, right?
Yes, the latter for sure. It is my practice has mainly been focusing on making recordings of sounds that I like and manipulating them, processing them, and changing them, and then using them in my pieces. The recording itself. Um, I, which is also to answer one of your previous questions that you asked about electronic music. Um, how did it happen? I think one of the reasons why was also that could I could start thinking about music and gestures, and sound combinations and just sounds instead of melody, harmony, rhythm in that framework. So that also made things very liberating for me. Um,
Why do you think that happens? Because it's a widely spread phenomenon of speaking of musical gestures.
I think that it's it's like, how can I answer that? I can answer that question for myself. I don't know for other people, but I think that for me, I feel that that was the next logical step in contemporary music practice to to move away from this conventional framework and move towards something that may spark a new direction. That's exactly what happened, especially when we had electronic music tools, when we had tapes and we had music concrete and we had synthesizer music. These tools did not work, certainly, in that framework of always, not always at least, in the framework of melody, harmony, rhythm. It's like, okay, there is repetition, but you don't know if there is, you create your own pulse. And music tend to be very gestural, especially with tapes, like with uh, slowing down a sound, speeding it up would give different results of the same sound. And I think one reason was that we had a new idea about uh, musicality, and gesture came to play its role. But also in acoustic music, in composers writing acoustic music, I think they just started leaning towards that direction because that was something new. There was a new territory to be explored. And then I think for composers, at least for me, it was like, okay, this is a new way of thinking about music. And realizing that gesture has always been a part of the practice forever. It's just that the way gestures, musical gestures were organized were in that framework of rhythm, harmony, melody. And now we are getting rid of that framework to a certain extent, or we are loosening it in some sense. And this is the result of that. This is what we get out of that. Um, so I think it's an evolution. It's an evolutionary process in the practice of music. Um, and not that every composer must or must not think in that way. Um, there's never an obligation. We can still choose to think in terms of melody, harmony, rhythm, and make new music. But I think that it it became more common because a lot of composers found something new in that way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say was this distinctly new feature of gestural versus what was before it?
What was new? I think
What made it so new? What was that uh, what of it was that made it so new in comparison to what was before?
I think whenever something, the word new is also problematic, but whenever something unique has happened, that we've considered a, a next step in what we are doing in our practice in music, um, a certain creative mind or composer or anyone who is working in any medium, not just music, has tried to not do things in a certain way, in a set pattern. They've tried to break patterns, they've tried to change the tools they use, and they've tried to make changes in their own practice and getting rid of certain tools or elements or anything that is pre-existing that gives you a direction of what music is. They have tried to not follow that, and as a consequence of getting rid of that framework, they've ended up doing something else, which we call new. That happened before as well with Schoenberg with atonality. That happened with 12-tone systems when we decided that music can also be made without having any key signatures, a certain tonality, and we can still make music. That was a practice of, you know, not following the tonal system anymore and still making music, and then you get is what you get. And similarly, this is what happened afterwards, that we decided to not think about music in that pre-existing framework of melody, harmony, rhythm, pulse, meter. At least, even if it exists, it is not uh, easily depicted, or it is not easily perceived in the music. You know, it is just there as a framework. So we started to get rid of those elements, and this was the result of that. We found a new direction, and then it took its own path. So it is always about, I think, in most cases, um do not follow a set pattern that you've been following.
Yeah. Well, as a disclaimer, this is what I work with in my own practice. But I'm curious, and perhaps it's more a consideration, a thought. What about accessibility? Perhaps those rhythms and melodies, those what you call framework, and that was then taken away. I would think that makes, and without judging whether that's good or bad, but that makes a composition more accessibility to a wide set of ears, to put it like that. What about accessibility? Do you consider that? Or do you consider how your music is received by listeners and the impacts of taking those frameworks away, for example, or of something else that you might keep in mind when you compose?
About the audience, you mean?
For example.
When I'm composing a piece, so far I've not been thinking about how the audience will receive it. At least not about their expectations with music, because then not to judge my audience, but when you're working with experimental music, you experiment, and then you don't try to fulfill expectations of other people. And so you make a piece, you put it out, you have a concert, then you have a response from the audience, and you realize how it was perceived, and if the audience is able to clearly understand what was happening and appreciate what happened on stage, or they were unsure about what they experienced, which is also a response, or they just didn't like it. You get all kinds of responses. Um, I think
Do you
that
ever get a response of someone being sure of knowing what happened?
yes,
Yeah?
yes, a lot of the times. But usually that audience is an audience of musicians, sometimes non-musicians as well, but that's not very common. Usually it's musicians who respond like, "Oh, that was great. That I could follow that," and then they would talk about the details in the piece, and but they're usually musicians. That is the challenge for now.
So we're speaking more to how you, perhaps the technical part of knowing what happened, or how something was produced, or are we speaking to conceptual parts of
Well,
the experiment?
not so much the technical part. I think more the aesthetic of your piece, the choices of sounds that you made, and the combinations, and to some extent maybe also the tools you've used, but not how you've done it, but more like, oh, look, just with one instrument and some recorded electronics, he made this, and it's aesthetically pleasing. It's sonically interesting to listen to. I think that is the main uh, direction of the response, more than the technicality of how it. Those questions come in afterwards. First is your experience of just listening. Yeah.
And experiments, could you give us an example of how it looks like, how you set the framework of an experiment, perhaps on a composition of yours? What is the framework of that experiment? Is there a question in place, or is anything else?
Yes. Sometimes it is a question. Like how would these sounds, if I put these sounds on these two instruments together, what would be the result? It's also an abstract question, but still a question. But sometimes I think the initial framework is given to a composer when with two things. The lineup of the piece, what are the instruments you're working with? That's a very clear framework. This is the lineup I have, these are the instruments I can use. So this is the kind of direction the piece will go into, not musically, but sound-wise. This is what's available to me in terms of musical instruments. So that is one, and I think another framework would be the how much time do I have before I need to finish the deadline? Uh, Usually we certainly we have fixed deadlines that okay, submit it in 3 months or 1 month or 2 weeks. It depends on that. So how far can I go with the kind of experiment that I want to make? Those are the two main factors for me. Um, and in terms of experimenting, it again comes down to uh, sketching a lot of material. And for me, it's really on an abstract level. It's trying out different combinations of sounds that I'm interested in, that I would like to listen to. If I'm making a piece with this ensemble, what would a piece of music for this ensemble should sound for me is what I will do for that piece. So that gives me a lot of direction. It has to be interesting to me, and then I can imagine that it would be interesting for someone else.
And do you trace how that actually evolves? Is there some is there causality in between? Do you trace it in between what works for you and what works for someone else, or the audience to which you usually present your pieces?
Yeah. What works for the audience? I don't know. And I think what they, controversial statement, but I have the feeling that the audience also does not know what works for them until it's given to them. And then they make a decision, oh, this actually works or this does not work. So the idea is to put it out anyway, not knowing if you think it'll work for them or not. But I think, yeah, they will only know once it's there. If it's not there, something that you find that it should be made in this way, and if you don't do that, you don't put it out, you will never know if the audience accepts it or likes it or yeah is inclined towards it in any way. So I try not to think about that too much. Uh, but the primary factor is to make something that is interesting to me. Um, but at the same time, to find that connection with the audience, I think there are always some things that transcend any style or any musical uh, practice, in composition at least, is that there are some things that need to be kept in mind uh, for at least for me. I think for any piece that I make, there are some things that I keep in mind. Um, for example, foreground, background, um, balance, um, texture, you know, thickening, thinning, or
What is
uh,
foreground or background?
something playing in the foreground with something is very clearly perceivable.
Okay,
In
so specialization basically.
visualization, not in terms of space in a certain location, but sort of a musical depth, a three-dimensional perspective on the musical texture.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Is
Um,
that called panning?
the
Or
panning is
panning is more
placing a
um,
sound in a certain
on
position.
a horizontal level.
Can be horizontal, can be surround.
Yeah.
This is more just a musical thing based on its texture, what stands out more and what
Mm-hmm.
is present, but it's not taking your focus as the main material, but it's something in the background that's adding to the texture, for example. Or silence, there's the
Mm-hmm.
sound and there needs to be some silence,
Mm-hmm.
leave some space, and then build from that again. So there are some things that always I try to keep in mind for any composition. And I
Yeah.
think if I craft that well,
Mm-hmm.
I think then you can build a connection with the audience.
Mm-hmm.
No
Mm-hmm.
matter what the piece is about, what kind of instruments and what sounds you're using, and if it's experimental composition. I think there are some factors that you always need to keep in mind, no matter the piece. Just music to make it musically interesting. Um, that always works. That always creates this kind of flow or a musical narrative of itself that
Mm-hmm.
communicates to the audience, and then they start to find a certain logic
Yeah.
in the music.
How do you
Um,
know
yeah.
which those factors are and in what way to apply them? Is that the intuition that's at work, or what happens there?
I think it's both. It's intuition and it's logical thinking, and they I think both of these things then inform each other. If I'm thinking in a certain with a certain logic and I start improvising, I will do things intuitively within that logical framework. Um,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
and sometimes I do something more intuitively without any logical mindset. I just do something very intuitively in the moment, and then it starts to develop its own logic. It is quite cyclic for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, yeah.
And again, if that's all right, since the thesis is not published yet, could we briefly touch upon what you work in there? Perhaps the metaphor
Yes,
and how you
yes,
work with that. Yeah,
yes, we can talk about that.
great. Please, perhaps briefly, what is it that you're working on in your thesis?
Yes. So my thesis for the master's was about sonic metaphors, and I was quite inspired by the work of Trevor Wishart, who's a British composer, sound artist, improviser, and he does a lot of experimentation with his voice, making different uh, sounds, textures, noises, gestures, um, and I was very much inclined towards that music. And my research was about forming metaphorical relationships between two different sounds. What that means is um, how can one sound give the impression of something else, another sound, but it's not that sound, it's not imitation, it's a sound that almost sounds like something else.
Mm.
Or it's a sound that in time can morph into something else, which was the practice of Trevor Wishart, which he talks about in his book on sonic art. And he talks about metaphors. And then I analyzed some of his pieces, and I found these morphologies of sounds. Um, and I was very inspired. I'm like,
Mhm.
this is another way of organizing sounds. And how can us, for example, the opening of his piece, Red Bird, uh, is a is a sound of a screaming woman that morphs into the sound of birds, but the bird sounds are symbolic. They are made synthetically. They are not actual recordings of birds, but they symbolize the sound of birds. But the screaming voice morphs into the sound of birds, and it gives a certain perceptual meaning. And that was the initial motivation to make this research, to have a sound and to either craft it or morph it in a certain way to make it sound like something else over time. And the other method that I wanted to use was just using a sound, not morphing it, but just finding a certain connection with another sound that they have similar perceptual qualities. They are not exactly the same sound, but they have something in common, um, that makes a connection that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's the second sound is almost the same, but it's not. And this is the same with objects, because the philosophical framework of the research is based on object-oriented ontology by Graham Herman. And he talks about objects having metaphorical connections, relationships, and only based on their perceptual quality and how we give meaning to a certain object with the qualities of another object. For example, when I say time is money, I know that in a literal sense, time is not actually money. But what we are trying to say with this metaphor is that time is equally valuable or as valuable as money. So the value of time is understood by talking about the qualities of money, its value. Um, and so he talks about giving a certain perceptual meaning to an object with the qualities of another object. And so I wanted to use that idea and apply it to sounds, to use a sound in a piece, and to give it a new meaning in the context of another sound that has different qualities. And maybe there is some similarity, perceptual similarity on a sonic level between these two sounds that gives this sound a new meaning, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that has been the whole direction of this research.
Mm-hmm. Um, I I would say that I can hear that very clearly in the inner voice recording that you have available. Is that already a combination of this research in the form of a composition?
Yes, yes. This piece has not been documented in the research paper, but this piece was intentionally made thinking about this idea.
Yeah, it's really
Uh,
clear there.
that's good to know. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had the recordings of my voice, all kinds of noises that I made. I processed them through coding, and I made different sound combinations using only my voice. And I made these tapes. And then these tape recordings or audio files, um, they gave me direction in terms of orchestration for the ensemble. And so certain gestures of the voice, certain noises, uh, I try to recreate them, not imitating exactly the audio file, the
Mhm.
recording of the voice,
Yeah.
but to suggest a certain perceptual sonic element that is present in the voice and to give that suggestion in some way in the orchestration.
Is
Yeah.
there more of your are there more of your compositions where you work so with this on that level?
There's another piece that I composed for 4 channels also this year, 4 speakers
Mm-hmm.
surround, and um, it's called Strings on a Railway Track. That's the name of the piece because I use sounds of string instruments, can be violin, cello, Um, and I combine them with, or I make metaphorical connections with other sounds. For example, the sounds of a train, a moving train, the horn, the I don't know, seagulls. I used sounds of seagulls as well. So I make these connections of other sounds with string instruments, and I make these morphologies from string sounds to other sounds of other objects or things that are recorded. Yeah, so that's one more piece that I also have documented in my research. Yes,
So that is the base of your composition for the research, or?
that was the artistic result
Mhm.
after studying different pieces of Wishart and other composers, Jonathan Harvey, and having all this framework of metaphor.
Mhm.
Uh, in my practice, I use those ideas and made these two pieces mainly. I also made another piece for bass clarinet and electronics. That was my first attempt,
Mhm.
but it was not a successful experiment initially because I was just imitating sounds of the bass clarinet in the electronics, and so it did not really create a real metaphor.
Mhm.
Because, for example, when I say,
Mhm.
uh, yeah, some like two objects that are very similar, right? Like an orange is like another orange. It's not a metaphor. Both are oranges.
Mhm.
But when an orange is like something completely different, like a papaya,
Mhm. Mhm.
due to some similarity in quality, then you have a real metaphor. So the main thing that I could not achieve was to make a clear difference distinction between the two sound objects. That I have sounds of bass clarinet, and the other sound that I'm trying to make a connection with needs to be quite different from
Mhm.
um, a bass clarinet sound. And if I also use a bass clarinet sound in the electronics, then it becomes imitation. So that was not a successful experiment, but also a piece intentionally made in this direction at that point. But
Mhm.
then later I found more clear, uh, yeah, paths find uh, to find a real result that I was looking for this research.
And in terms of your future work and opus that you are building, what does that mean for it? This research that you made, do you intend to continue working on this?
Yes, I think.
Or did you now establish a certain system that you can apply, or how does it work?
Well, there is a certain direction. I wouldn't say there's already a system right now. I think the research was like my initial steps in this direction. And I think a lot can be developed, crafted. A framework can be more refined in this direction. I just think that it is not, there are some ideas, there are some parameters that I discovered in the process of working in this research, but there are many more things that can be applied, which I don't know yet what they are, but it will come in the process of making pieces. So yes, I plan to continue on this research,
Mhm.
and I just want to know for myself what all can I do with this framework, this concept. Um, but yeah, it's still an unknown territory, and it's very fascinating for me because using a for me using a tool from language, like spoken language, like metaphor, and
Mhm.
applying it in a different language and seeing the result of that is very inspiring. It's I have a lot of curiosity that can my the second question I have to myself for this is, can I actually find more concepts in language like metaphor and apply them in a musical language? Is that even possible? Um, but for now, I think if I just stick to metaphor, I can. That's already enough. There's a lot of work in that direction itself. But it's quite uh, yeah, intriguing,
Mhm.
basically,
Mhm.
to know how languages work. especially without words, without only with sounds. Yeah.
So if right now you were given infinite assets to produce a musical compositional work, what would you do?
What would I do?
Yeah,
Like as the next step in terms of composing for my
perhaps, yeah.
ah. The short answer is I would just make a lot of more pieces, a lot of new pieces, a lot of new music, and experiment. And maybe sometimes not even make pieces, but just take two sounds and put them together and see if I can make a connection or morph them and refine my own technique. That's what I would do for sure. Uh, well, the short answer became a long answer. But I think that on a technical level, I would also reflect on the practice and see if I can find more parameters, find more musical elements that are relevant to making music with metaphors in this way. Um, it can be texture or using certain kind of technology or I don't know, spectral analysis or I don't know, something that is more relevant musically as an element to working with sonic metaphors. And I would try to uh, document them. I would write them down that, okay, need to keep in mind, these are the musical elements to keep in mind while working with metaphors. I think that will give more clarity. It will refine the framework and give me more direction. Then I can be faster in my practice to get certain results. So it becomes a bit scientific, but it's not so scientific because it sounds scientific, I think. But it's just working with music, different musical parameters and still making music. So yeah, is to create, to get practice-based knowledge and theorize it afterwards. Yes.
And just briefly, what is your, if there is one, favorite metaphor in language? If you have one.
Oh, what is this
Or did we
one?
already hear the time is money?
Time is money is quite a relevant research. You need to be efficient. That's what it is. That's
Yeah, all
true.
right. And
Good one,
look,
right?
we're approaching the conclusion here. Would you care to share two messages for the listeners? One for anyone that might aspire to begin with composition, and the other one with to someone that will go and listen to your music after this.
Ah, well, for someone going and listening to my music, uh, I don't know who you are, but I would just say try to keep an open mind and try to sit through the whole piece uh, without making any, without thinking about your expectations with music. Just listen and see what you feel, what you think afterwards. And I think I'm trying to practice that when I listen to a piece of music to not bring in my own expectations of what music should be. Uh, that is one thing. And I don't have any specific message to give. I don't think I'm in a position to give a message to people of what they should do with music. Uh, but I don't know. I don't know what to say to people. I think um, I can say to maybe something that I do in my own practice that maybe can be insightful for other people working with uh, composers or just creative people working in composition in some way or just creating. Um, what I can say is eh, what worked for me was to focus on the craft, um, to refine my craft, to compose and get practice-based knowledge, um, and not to be. This is sort of the summary of what my journey has been. Is to not be confined by conceptual thinking, but using it as a tool to find direction in your practice for a piece, and bringing in your musicality at the same time, and making pieces where your musicality also plays a very important role, not just the concept that gives you a certain direction, if that makes sense. I think a lot of creative people are able to think very well conceptually, but I think that a lot of young composers are not able to bring that very clearly in their practice. And I think sometimes the concept is great. You have a very creative idea. It's brilliant. But then the only way you can communicate that idea is when you have a good sense of technique and a certain grip on your tools and a good sense of craft. It comes with doing it and practicing it. That is how you can achieve what you're hoping for. I think that is something that we not in these times. I feel that's something we do not focus on as much, or it's not talked about enough as much as other things around composition. As you said, we're working a lot with improvisation. We're also working a lot with talking about any social or political ideas in our music, and you're free to do that. But I think for me, it comes down to refining your craft as well, and just bringing in your musicality as well, no matter what the idea is, no matter what you want to say through your piece, which you're free to do so. But I think, yeah, a good grip on your tools is very important for any creative person. Yes, that's all I had to say.
Thank you
That's
very
something
much.
that has worked for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, perfect. It's very possible it works for someone else as well. Thank you for taking your time and sharing with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.